It's a year since Liz Truss began her utterly disastrous premiership, and to mark that moment, her closest ally and former Chancellor, Kwasi Kwarteng, has given a rather bizarre interview to Piers Morgan.
You've never said sorry for
I've never said
what happened a year ago, just over a year ago.
What I've said, I bear responsibility for it.
Why not say sorry?
And what I want to do is to make sure that we actually get back to a growth agenda.
What do you bear responsibility for?
Well, I think the way that we delivered it and the speed with which it was delivered was wrong. And I've put up my hand frequently and said we should have taken more time. We should have had a more balanced approach. And I've said that repeatedly in interviews, on television.
What I'm really curious why you've never been able to bring yourself to say the simple words, I'm sorry. After all the damage that was inflicted by that ruinous 44-day regime of Liz Truss, and I'm sure that you would say, and we'll come to this, a lot of it was on her.
No, I'm not here to apportion blame. I mean, that's one of the reasons why.
But if you take responsibility for causing...
That's one of the reasons why.
I get it. But if you take responsibility, why are you also not prepared to say sorry?
So I think it sounds like a lawyerly distinction, but I think there's a difference between saying I was responsible.
Sounds like a bit like a cowardly distinction.
No, Kwasi. Because actually, a lot of the debate, and you've probably been following this, if you look at things like slavery and reparations and all of that is all about saying, I'm sorry. And in those instances, the people themselves weren't entirely responsible for stuff that happened 200 or 300 years ago.
I agree with you.
So what, in terms
I don't see why people today should be apologising for the behaviour of ancestors 300 years ago. But you weren't. No, you were the guy.
What a bizarre rhetorical move, right? So he was the Chancellor when they crashed the economy, right? So obviously we know what they did. They said we're going to give the rich all of these tax cuts. And not only are we not going to sort of balance the books and say we funded this tax cut, because I don't think you always do need to sort of balance the books in that way that you're sort of an accountant or doing it via whatever the Office for Budget Responsibility's most recent projection is. I do think you can be more flexible than that. The problem they had was they said, we're just going to cut taxes and then hope by magic the economy grows to pay for it. There was no sort of step-by-step plausible account of how that would work. Now, what did that do? It did crash the economy, it increased interest rates on people's mortgages. And Kwasi Kwarteng is saying, well, no, this is kind of like the slavery issue, because then people want people to say sorry who it's not actually their fault. Now, this would work if we were talking about Kwasi Kwarteng's like grandchildren. Kwasi Kwarteng's great-great-grandchildren should not have to apologise for Liz Truss's mini-budget. But Kwasi Kwarteng was the Chancellor. There is no analogy to the issue of reparations of slavery. Dalia, why did Kwasi Kwarteng decide to go for the slavery reparations argument as to why he shouldn't apologise for his own budget, which he wrote and announced a year ago?
I mean, because he did what every Tory does when they find themselves boxed into a corner, which is to reach for the nearest so-called culture war issue they can find. Crucially, Kwasi Kwarteng is wrong about what reparations is. And that's actually what really pissed me off. Reparations isn't about white guilt. It's not about getting apologies or sorries from individual white people. White guilt is actually useless. It has no meaning. It's uninteresting. It's boring. It's not what we're interested in. Reparations is about understanding that humans and resources was stolen on a systematic scale in a way that has created economic inequalities, not only between people, but between countries that have not only still remain today, but are only getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And that it is therefore justified to redistribute that wealth in order to bring everyone back to par. And this idea of individual white families paying reparations, obviously, that's one model of reparations, but actually the kind that the reparations movements broadly are asking for more is actually in terms of being done in a more structural, systemic level. So we're talking about, a redistribution of wealth from the global north to the global south. We're talking about climate reparations, moving that money from the global north where it sits illegitimately and was stolen, and investing that into the kinds of resilient systems and, freeing global South countries up to be able to use that money in order to build the kind of systems that they need to be resilient in an era of climate breakdown, which, of course, the people who will be impacted by are not the causes of that crisis. And so even the reparations metaphor, as he says it, is completely wrong, because it's not about saying sorry. Your sorry is useless. Your sorry isn't going to pay my rent or put food on my table or do any of that nonsense. If we're talking about, colonialism in my case, but also chattel slavery. But yeah, I mean, Kwasi Kwarteng didn't bring up that specific point in order to make a coherent argument. He brought up that point because he wanted to say a trigger word that was going to pull the Talk TV audience or the Piers Morgan watchers to his side, which is, hey, isn't it crazy that Black people are asking for reparations? Let's talk about that, because I would rather talk about that, which I know will get your audience frothing at the mouth, than actually talk about the very recent history that I have in screwing up this country's economy. But I actually have a weirdly unexpected, not defense, but kind of caveat to Kwasi Kwarteng's point that he shouldn't take sole responsibility or solely apologize for what happened under the Liz Truss government. Because actually, that budget was not just a product of Kwasi Kwarteng and Liz Truss. It was a product of a whole ecosystem, more concretely fronted by the Institute of Economic Affairs, but a whole range of institutions that have kind of gotten off scot-free for, heavily lobbying and pushing someone like a Kwasi Kwarteng or a Liz Truss, who are gullible enough to take it, to create such a crisis in this country. So they really should be getting as much, if not more, smoke than Kwasi Kwarteng and Liz Truss. And because they're kind of faceless, whilst Kwasi Kwarteng is getting asked questions, the IEA is still being taken seriously as an actual legitimate economic think tank.
Let's take a look at Kwasi Kwarteng expanding on why he shouldn't be held responsible.
I was not the sole agent of what happened.
What I can't get my head around. Why are you so desperate?
And what I'm trying to say.
Why are you so desperate not to apologise?
Because what will happen is if I say,
I'm sorry.
Well, then Gillian's got to say, everyone's got to apologise for it.
Never mind anybody else.
No, that's important. And I just think that it's very easy to get politicians who are ultimately responsible for things to try and say, okay, I'm sorry.
When politicians screw up badly and it impacts on millions of people's lives, I think that it is incumbent on them not only to take responsibility, but to apologise.
So I've taken responsibility. I accept that the implementation.
But you're not sorry.
I still think the strategy was the right.
But you're not sorry for the implementation.
And I think we'll come.
But you're not sorry for the implementation.
And I think we'll come round to.
Do you not find it a bit ridiculous?
No, I don't. Because look, we're playing a game here.
We're not playing a game. It's not a game to the millions of people. It's not a game to the people whose lives were affected.
I was saying that I was completely responsible. Not completely responsible, but I was involved in those decisions.
I was saying that I was completely responsible. No, I wasn't completely responsible. There's a lot of strange things going on with Kwasi Kwarteng's arguments in this interview. But I think the idea that unless you are the sole person who is responsible for something, you should not apologize is also quite a strange notion, right? I'm not going to apologize for anything unless I did it entirely on my own. So if you're sort of part of a gang which robs a bank, say, well, I'm not going to say sorry because it wasn't just me that robbed the bank. Well, maybe all three of you should say sorry, right? If you're a gang of three and you rob a bank and you say, well, do you want to say, you stand up in court, do you want to apologize for robbing the bank? You caused a lot of trauma to the staff there, to the attendants, to the tellers. And then you say, well, I'm not going to apologize. Make the other guy apologize. Make my gang member over there apologize. The judge is not going to look well on that. The judge is going to say, well, if you were part of the whole robbery conspiracy, you should probably say sorry. You can't just say, well, don't look at me, look at the other guys, right? He wasn't just any old member of the gang that crashed the economy. He was the chancellor, right? It's the, other than the prime minister, it's the most important job when it comes to determining the economic strategy. It was him who stood up and delivered the mini budget. And now he's saying, well, I know I read out the mini budget and I know I was responsible for the mini budget, but there was some civil servants involved and there was some other ministers involved. Why do you want me to apologize? I'm only in part responsible, so I'm definitely not going to say sorry. Like, you are a very small child, it seems. This is a moral lesson that I feel like one should have to teach like a 5-year-old, not a former chancellor. In his defense, Kwasi Kwarteng did push back successfully on at least one point.
Were you the shortest living chancellor in history?
Well, actually, Ian MacLeod was, but that's a different...
All right, so you're the second shortest living chancellor. Hang on.
Okay.
Shortest living chancellor in history. She was one of the shortest prime minister. 44 days of mayhem, right? She couldn't even outlast a lettuce.
Now, Kwasi Kwarteng is absolutely right. Liz Truss was the shortest serving prime minister, but he was only the second shortest serving chancellor. So in a way, he did better than Liz Truss. What he didn't mention is that the reason the other guy's tenure ended after just 30 days is because he died of a sudden heart attack in office. So it's Kwasi Kwarteng. No, I wasn't the shortest serving chancellor. I was the second shortest serving chancellor. Well, what happened to the other one? He didn't do a disastrous mini budget. He died. A surprise heart attack in 1970. Dahlia, if your only claim to success is that you lasted longer in the position of chancellor than the guy who died of a sudden heart attack, I mean, what does that say about your record?
I mean, I guess it's what helps him go to sleep at night. I guess it's when your other person didn't outlast the lettuce, the fact that you outlasted a human being, probably feels like a pretty good badge for you. But, I mean, where is the politics of personal responsibility, Kwasi? What about, pulling yourself up by the bootstraps and taking responsibility for your actions? Or is that just reserved for, people with disabilities trying to get some benefits so that they can, live a dignified life?
Very entertaining. You might have crashed the economy, but he's still giving us fantastic content to show on this program. Because if we're looking for examples of elites who are out of touch and completely away with the fairies, Kwasi Kwarteng and Liz Truss, they cannot be beaten.